Hello, I'm Eric Devereaux, and welcome back to this series of videos regarding my textbook, Methods of Policy Analysis. The textbook is available to you for free, and there will be a link in the description that you can use to download it in PDF format, the second edition. And actually today, in today's video, I'm going to explain why the textbook is free and talk about some issues that are in this particular chapter. Today's chapter is Chapter 8. So let me first and foremost share my screen so you can see the burst page for that, or the first page for that chapter, and remind you where we are in this series. So in this series of videos, we've been working through the section, the first major unit of the textbook that deals with diagnosing aspects of the public policy world, public policy outcomes that are deemed less than acceptable by your client, by your boss, by your organization. These are problems that we've decided we need to address. Maybe the society has decided that, the political system has decided that, your organization has decided that, perhaps even just you have decided that something is awry and you would like to find a way to improve outcomes. So in this section of the book, we've looked at different process models that can be used to diagnose public policy outcomes, explain them, understand them. And with a process model that shows us how a process is working, we can identify points of intervention where we might be able to fix a problem, or at least understand why it is happening and get a handle on the opportunities for improvement. So in this chapter, Chapter 8, we're moving into what are really some of the most generic and flexible approaches to doing process modeling. Um, some people, when they encounter this material, think it is a license to simply run wild across the landscape. It is not. This is actually a very difficult set of modeling approaches in this chapter that I discuss. And you don't want to go sort of running wild and think you have a license to do anything and call it an analysis. You actually have to be very careful here, and I'm going to go through a couple elements of that in this video so you can understand it. So let me stop the sharing of the first page of that chapter, and let me turn now to the device that I've been using to draw for you so that I can sort of dynamically discuss what's going on here. So I'm just going to switch over my camera a little bit so that I don't have to get too far away when I do the drawing. So let's go. So we're talking about stocks, flows, and rates. And really, all of this, as you will see, is related to causal models and also something that causal models are connected to in the world of statistical analysis, path models or path analysis. For those of you who are taking advanced statistical methods as part of your training, you will undoubtedly come across path analysis, which is a methodology that grows out of standard multiple regression modeling in statistics. When we're talking about stocks, flows, and rates, we're first and foremost talking about stocks. Stocks are quantities. And this is really important because many people, when they first start building these kind of models, instead of referring to quantities or essentially stuff, things that we can count, instead what they start putting into the labels of in the components of the model are activities, actions, verbs, people doing things. And that is not what these models begin with. They begin with quantities that are measurable, or at least are conceived to be measurable. We want to be able to measure things in the public policy space and then look at relationships among them. So the metaphor that I want to start out here with you to keep in your mind is thinking about the flow of water in a watershed. Where in a watershed you have stocks like lakes, oceans, ponds, and then you have places where water flows from one point to another, streams and rivers. And so you have water in stocks that flow from one place to another. When water flows, it changes the stocks. Water can flow from one pond to another. The first pond now has less water. The next one has more water. There's been a change in the stock accomplished by a flow, right? And so flows are movements. These are movements among stocks. And then we have rates. Rates describe movement. sorry, rates describe movement. And rates have two components. They have a value and they have a sign. The sign usually we just denote in our world as a plus or a minus. Plus means that there's a positive relationship happening here, where as something increases, something else will increase. And a minus means there's an inverse relationship. As something goes up, something else goes down. So these are the components we work with. Stocks, quantities that we can measure and label as basically some form of stuff that we can count. Flows, movements between stocks, rates that describe those movements, okay? And with these tools, we can begin to build a model. Now I'm going to stop here and just briefly discuss an issue in chapter 8 of the book. The first example that I go through in great detail in chapter 8 in the second edition has to do with obesity. And in that discussion, I adopt the approach of caloric excess caloric consumption as one of the explanations for obesity, that people become obese because they consume more calories in a day than their body needs in order to maintain itself. And the excess calories result in weight gain. And over time, you can get a feedback loop, which we'll talk about in a second, and people begin to become obese. The problem is the latest findings in medical science have called into question that view of obesity as a reasonable approach to take when looking at population level issues in obesity. I should have known better, mea culpa, to have built a model around an issue of medical science. I'm not a medical scientist, and I did not acknowledge at the time that I wrote that material that medical science was not settled. And so when I write a third edition of this textbook, if that day rolls around, I will not be using an example drawn from medical science in illustrating this chapter. But one of the reasons that I'm giving this book away is I don't like asking people to pay for something that I know has known defects. And this content in chapter 8 about obesity, I now consider to be defective. It's an interesting example to read through, and the logic of how I put it together is worthwhile, but the conclusions no longer are well supported by medical science. So something else that I now will talk about here before we move on to an example is feedback. Feedback occurs when a movement from one stock to another creates a loop back that reinforces that movement, right? Feedback can be positive or amplifying. When you have positive feedback, the process amplifies itself and can run out of control. The example of positive feedback you very painfully have encountered in your life is a microphone at like a music concert that is experiencing positive feedback, and suddenly you get a nearly unbearable squeal over the PA system from it. And then negative feedback, you have a situation where the feedback mechanism dampens. Instead of amplifying, it dampens a process and tends to shut it down, okay? Very often, we have situations where we have positive feedback and we need to make that into negative feedback and stop something from going out of control. Or we could have negative feedback that could be actually even killing people, for example, causing mortality to rise. And we need to do something to stop that, okay? So let's work through an example now in the remainder of this video briefly so you can get a sense of how this works. So before I go deep into the example, I also want to just give you some general issues in building these types of models. So usually we are talking about a stock, let's just label it A for now, and it has a flow that goes to another stock, which we will label B, and there is a rate associated with it. There's some type of rate. And again, this rate could be positive or it might be negative, okay? That is, if A goes up, B goes up, or if A goes up, B goes down, okay? And these, again, are things that we can measure. Now, there are some issues that arise in these models that I want to talk to you about just briefly structurally. And I want to also, I'm sorry for leaning off the camera for a minute to pick something up. I wanted to show you this book. This book by Judea Pearl, The Book of Why, which he co-wrote with Dana McKenzie, is one of the most phenomenal books of this century. It's one of the most important books ever written in the history of social science, and also anything related to social science, which includes our field of policy analysis. I cannot recommend this book enough. Everyone should read it. It's had a huge influence on me as a thinker about the types of models I'm talking about today and about thinking about causation in general. And some of what I'm going to be talking about right now comes directly from this and reflects this analysis of how causality works. Okay, let me just put that book back down for a minute. All right. So we have this is a standard and very simple type of relationship that could be read causally. A is causing B. Often we might not be able to say that. Instead, we might be able to say there's a relationship between A and B where we can see in the data A goes up and then B goes up. And so we have a positive relationship. Or when A goes up, B goes down. May not be 100% sure about the causality, but at least we can see the relationship. Okay. Or if we have an idea about the causality, then we can say a causal model, right, which is a form of logic and reasoning, uh, tells us that there should be a relationship of a certain type between A and B. And then when we see that relationship actually in our measurements of reality, then what we are saying is that that is helping to confirm our understanding of the causal relationship. Or if we don't see that relationship, maybe it's disconfirming what it is we thought might be true, and maybe we need to go in a different direction. So if you look at these A's and B's, this is the most standard example, but there's another example that looks like this, where in between A and B is C, and we didn't know about C, and now we do. This is called a mediator. C is a mediator. Now, Judea Pearl in his book likes to use a really interesting language I think is very useful. He says to say that B is being caused by A is to say that B is listening to A. When A talks, B listens and reacts. Okay, I really like that. So in this particular example of the mediator, B is not listening to A. B is listening to C, and C is listening to A. Indirectly, B is getting affected by A, but you have to know what's going on with the mediation of C, okay? Or else you get your understanding of the world wrong. I build lots of models with mediators. There's another example that looks like this, where both A and B are impacting C simultaneously from both sides. This is when you have something called a collider. And when you have a collider, you can make a lot of mistakes about how you think the world is working because you are not understanding the independent impact of A and B on C correctly. You have to measure both and parcel those out and find out what is happening with that. And then we have one last example, which is called a fork. Okay. And the fork is actually something that you probably did encounter previously, even in K through 12 education. They do talk about this, which sort of a false causality or coming to a false conclusion. A fork looks like this. When you have a fork, you could think that A and B are connected, that they are somehow one is listening to the other, but actually they're both listening to C. C is forked in both directions and it's influencing both A and B simultaneously. And you could draw a false conclusion about the relationship between A and B unless you understand that the fork is in there. So keep in mind the possibility of a mediator, a collider, or a fork as you work through these types of models. It's really important. So now I'm just going to finish here by going through a very straightforward example that is actually quite relevant often in public policy in the United States. It has to do with jobs, unemployment, unemployment insurance, and welfare benefits utilization. Okay, and I'm going to use the methodology that's advocated in the chapter, which is you start at the end, at the outcome, the result that you are concerned about, and then you work your way back. Okay, so we're going to look at welfare benefit utilization. This is something we can count. Welfare benefit utilization is a measure. We can measure this. It's measured in different ways. The number of people or the number of households that right now are using different types of welfare benefits. It could be cash assistance, housing assistance. It could be SNAP, the food stamp program, or anything like that. So we can count that, right? And we want to understand what is driving this. Now, here is the interesting thing. Often in the United States, it's very consistent to find that a certain number of households that should be eligible for and using different types of welfare benefits are not doing it. And the question is why, right? So one question that we could be asking, one outcome we don't like is that we're a state or local government, we're offering benefits to people to help them with income supports to prevent problems that might affect their children, lack of healthcare access, lack of food access, these types of issues, and they're not using the benefit. Okay, why are they not using the benefit? So, of course, one of the things that we know way in the background that is driving welfare benefit utilization are economic conditions. So economic conditions, this is another noun, it's another quantity. We have ways we measure it. But one of them is we could do what's going on with the number of jobs, right? What's going on with growth, with measures of what's going on with growth, right? So here is the thing. We expect the following relationship. If economic conditions, jobs, and growth go down, if these go down, then welfare benefit utilization should go up, right? So it would be perfectly reasonable to draw an arrow like this, put a rate in here, and say that this is a positive, that this is, sorry, this is an inverse relationship, a negative relationship, okay? In other words, when economic conditions improve, welfare utilization goes down. When economic conditions decline, and we can measure it like number of jobs goes down, welfare utilization should go up. And we could even estimate some rates here that seem to connect the two, okay? But then there's other factors that may be affecting this, okay? So first off, for people to utilize benefits, okay, we can actually count applications for benefits. We can actually count these. What's going on with our applications for benefits? And we know the following. We know that there's another rate, it's positive, that says as the number of people apply for benefits, the number of households receiving benefits should go up. Okay? But what affects applications for benefits? Okay? So one of the things we can measure is we can actually measure awareness of eligibility. Okay? This is something that we can actually go out and find out. Do people know that they, in fact, that they are eligible for benefits? Are they aware that they can get these benefits? So we would expect there to be another rate in here that as awareness of eligibility goes up, we would have a positive relationship. So we're building a model that says awareness of eligibility can cause applications for benefits to increase, and that can increase welfare benefit utilization, okay? But there can be something else that we can put in here, okay? Awareness of eligibility, but we can also put in compliance requirements. I'm not going to build out a fully detailed model here for you in the interest of time, but I'm just going to stop with this one. So there has been tremendous interest in our field about the compliance requirements in order to access welfare benefits, okay? And if we increase the compliance requirements, then what we do is we decrease applications for benefits. Okay, so there's a negative relationship. The harder it is to apply for benefits and keep your benefits, the less people will submit applications to do it, and the lower welfare benefit utilization will be. In fact, there's an entire literature in our field. You can look it up. It goes under the label administrative burden, and it is most associated with the work of Professor Don Moynihan, who is now at the University of Michigan, and his co-workers. And what they have been focusing on is how governments have intentionally increased the compliance requirements at times in order to drive down welfare benefit applications and welfare benefit utilization. They have used the compliance requirements as a control mechanism in this regard. So this is just the beginning of building out a view that can help us to understand why welfare benefit utilization ends up, among other things, rarely ever saturating in the population, and a lot of households that should be receiving benefits are not receiving them, okay? So this is just a very straightforward beginning example of how to do this. Modeling with stocks, flows, and rates is interesting and fun and creative. You have to put a lot of time into revising your models and thinking through them. They can lead directly to issues of measurement and what can you measure and what data can you get. You can start doing studies where you can look at the relationship between one factor and another and begin to figure out how one factor is listening to another factor. Governments can use this, for example, or nonprofits can also use this for an example, to try to expect the demand for their services as conditions change out in the society. Anyway, I hope you read Chapter 8 very thoroughly a couple times and learn from it. I do apologize about the one issue involving the analysis of obesity. While the logic of how I go through that I think is important, I just want to recognize again that that argument itself pretty much is not supported at this time by medical science. Thank you again for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you when we have the next video in the series, where we will begin transitioning very quickly out from diagnosing what's going on with issues in public policy and trying to move into thinking about how we might respond to and intervene to improve the outcomes. Bye now.